Shalom to everyone. In this presentation, we are going to review the Parasha of Pinchas. And in this presentation, we are going to connect the acts of immorality and carnal desires with idol worship. And we're going to understand this morality and spirituality in terms of biblical context. And we are going to focus on this idea of fleshly desires, the idolatry, and the part of critical faith. So during this presentation, we will look at biblical text, we will look at scholarly insights to better understand the complex interplay of morality and spirituality. So it is undeniable today to understand that all forms of media carry underlying messages. Many of these are rooted in immorality and carnal desires. And their goal is often to entice and draw people into patterns of thought and behavior that lead to different forms of bondage. And here we can literally talk about all types and all forms of media, not just digital, but all types of media. When we open up a magazine or when we read something, the underlying message is, or the underlying goal of the media is to entice a person into a certain action. And even if it's in some sort of advert in selling a product, we can realize that most of the things that we have seen, even to sell a product or to promote a service, is sometimes just rooted in this idea or this foundation of immorality and focusing on the individual's fleshly desires. So we find the reality today that people buy things that they really didn't need, or they suddenly had an urge or a fleshly desire to enter into some sort of contract because media was presenting with some sort of vision or some sort of pattern thought that led this individual into this behavior, or eventually into some sort of contract, or what we can call in the terms of a bondage. So it is important to understand that this is not something that has happened just in our time because of the digital media. It is something that is relevant today only. But actually, it is far more, and it goes far back, and this is what we are going to look into the Parashat of Pinchas, that this ultimate foundation of immorality and creating of carnal, fleshly desires we can find in this biblical context. So in this parasha, we are going to look at in various themes focusing on this idea of immorality, connecting us into sometimes a spiritual, or most of the times into a spiritual bondage. So this parasha opens with God rewarding Pinchas for his action, so the grandson of Aaron, for his zealous act in stopping the plague by killing Zimri and Cosbi, who were flagrantly violating God's covenant. And we can basically talk about it as God's marriage covenant. So it's not just about a law, but it is a marriage covenant between God and his people. And therefore this episode follows this horrific sin of adultery, where the Israelites, while camped in Shittim, engaged in this sexual immorality with Moabite women and worshipped Baal Peor. So the rest of the parasha then details the census, the tribal allocations, the laws of inheritance and offerings. But the core moral And spiritual crisis then is rooted in the act of this transgression, this sin of adultery towards God at Shittim. So in this presentation, we are going to review the Parashat Pinchas, and we're going to explore this intersections of desire, idolatry, and faith through Jewish as well as Christian perspectives. We are going to analyze the biblical episodes and reflect on theological and ethical implications. And here we are going to look at commentaries and even some perspectives, for instance, from Roy Gain, Professor Roy Gain, which is which is a professor of the Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern languages at Andrews University in Michigan. And we're going to look at his perspective, tying this action to a spiritual bondage, a breaking or an adulterous action towards God. And then we're looking at classical Jewish ideas, commentaries, and then we are going to have practical reflections that we can take from this presentation to understand, not just to understand, but to also to help us, and to, when we are faced and when we are seeing and we live in the system every day, that we become always aware of this. So the immorality and its connection to idol worship, we start by what really happened. So the Israelites were seduced into sexual immorality with Moabite women, were associated with the worship of Baal Peor. So Baal Peor, a god linked with licentious rites and fertility cults. So the core is that this wasn't just a casual fornication with Moabite women, but it was actually an act of spiritual treason, not just adultery, but absolute treason towards God. And the fleshly desires for the Moabite woman was but just then the gateway drug to idolatry. And this lust weakened the people's spirituality defenses, making them vulnerable to embracing the cultic rituals that these women represent. So the biblical text itself, along with traditional commentaries, often then highlights that this was not merely just a sin of forbidden sexual relations, but was far more. It was a profound violation of the covenantal, the marriage relationship with God. So their bodies became then this vehicle for this idolatrous defilement. So when we refer back to our era today, where we live in this digital media, we can see that everything represented and given to a person is to weaken the individual's spiritual defenses. And the aim or the message or the purpose is to weaken their, making them vulnerable to embracing this ritual or embracing what they are selling. And then most of the time leading to a spiritual digress of the covenantal relationship with God. So if we then specifically look at Numbers chapters 25, 1 to 3, and we look at the background, the context, just before Pinchas' actions, we can see that the verse tells us while Israel was staying at Shittim, the men began to commit harlotry with the daughters of Moab. So they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So there are a critical information given to us in this verse, and this connects then the two sins explicitly with each other. The one of sexual immorality with Moabite women, and then the idolatry, participating in the sacrifices to Baal Peor. So we can see that the one action leads to the another action. So it was with a pretense that the woman, or the Moabite woman, came to the nation of Israel. It wasn't just to commit sexual harlotry, but it was to actually entice them into serving another god. While we knowing that the Torah tells us, and you shall have no other gods before me, this was the whole aim that we later learn at the end of the book of Numbers, where we know that Balaam was behind all this decisions, or this advice given to them for the nation of Israel to break their marriage or covenant relationship with God. So we notice then how the text shows they are intertwined. Sexual sin led directly to the worship of foreign gods. So when we go to verse 6 to 9, then Pinchas saw a man of Israel bringing a Midianite woman into his family, and he pierced them both, and the plague was stopped. But those who died by the plague were 24,000. So the violence Pinchas enacted wasn't just zealotry for zeal's sake, but it was an urgent defense of the sanctity of the covenant between Israel and Hashem, their husband. So Pinchas was not acting because he felt that he needed to do it, but he felt that it was about God's name, God's covenant with the nation of Israel, and therefore acting upon that. So the text links then the sin, firstly, to death, a plague, underscoring how deadly mixing covenant faithfulness with idolatry and sexual immorality is. So if we just think back to the first slide, we can see if this mix of covenant unfaithfulness is so deadly, then we can understand why the enemy is specifically using the same recipe even today. Because it is unfortunate, a reality, that the desires of man have not changed, or the fleshly desires of man have not changed, and the old recipe still works today. So when we look then at Roy Gain, which is then a professor at Andrews University in Michigan, his perspective tying this whole idea, we see that in his writing on the Hebrew Bible, he clarifies this connection by emphasizing how the lustful act and the idol worship were one and the same sin in their effect. It wasn't actually about two different types of action, but it was actually one sin in their effect. So Gain sees this episode as a vivid demonstration of how unrestrained desire for the flesh leads the heart away from God and into the worship of other powers. And we can see why things are the way that they are today. Because the media, the everything that we see today is pointing to or is building upon this unrestrained desire for something. It might be a car, it might be a house, it might be something that you don't even need. So and eventually this unrestrained desire of the flesh leads the heart away from God and into into this bondage of, and sometimes into a physical contract, that you are bound into some sort of contract. So you bought something that you didn't really want. So we see that gain is giving us this real connection of the two sins being actually one and the same in their effect. So in his book, Cult and Character, and other similar works, Gain argues then that the Israelites' men's involvement with Moabite women was not an accidental or isolated. And we see this later, because we see that Balaam was behind all of this. He knew what advice he gave to the king of Balak. So it was not accidental, it was not isolated, but it was a deliberate act to tie the men of Israel to the worshipping of Baal Peor. So the sexual immorality was then ritualized. It served as a cultic practice, binding the people to the foreign god through bodily acts. And perhaps the most relevant that we can speak about this, where this sexual immorality was ritualized, we can see so relevant in the music industry, and the way that the shows are presented, and the way that some of the acts, or the stages, and even the whole show is designed in such a way to be a ritualized manner, to tie the individual into this binding themselves to a foreign god. So such behavior is seen as idolatry, because it replaces God's covenantal holiness. So it replaces the idea of this marriage covenant, this absolute holiness within a marital environment, with profane and corrupt passions, turning physical desires into a spiritual bondage. So when we look then at his various insights in his book and his writings, we see that participation equals to worship, one and the same thing. So when you participate, you worship. It's called a sacred prostitution. So the desire then becomes this gateway. So lust as forced in initiation into some sort of worship, and in this case it was also a Baal worship. So body as a spiritual arena, we can understand why Paul mentioned in the New Testament, don't you know that you are a temple of the Ruach HaKodesh? So the body became this holy temple to the foreign god, and where the ritual boundaries were basically broken with within a covenant relationship with God. So we see then from a classical Jewish commentary that Ramban Nachmanides also comments, that says that Pinchas' zeal is praised as defending God's honor against defilement. So the whole idea was not about just Pinchas' action, but about his motive behind this. So the sin was not only moral, but a political, spiritual rebellion against God's kingship. And this was the motivation behind Pinchas. Pinchas saw this not just as a defilement, as a sexual immorality act, but it was almost a blatant rebellion against God's covenant, his kingship. And we see that Sforno mentions that the sexual sin was a way to draw the people into idolatry. So it was a pathway. It was just the first step, and both are inseparable. So the fleshly is the physical manifestation of a spiritual corruption. And then further on, Malbim says that the plague punished not just the act, but the spiritual breach. It wasn't about punishing the physical act only, but it's about the spiritual breach that was created in this whole process. So the worship of other gods through these acts. And further on, we see that the Torah itself in Leviticus and Devarim, Deuteronomy, forbidden sexual relations are frequently linked to idolatry. So the act of joining physical with foreign women connected to pagan cults. And this we can see even in external biblical writings and commentaries. And it was tantamount to joining in their gods, into a foreign god's worship. And we even see within the prophets, when Hosea and Ezekiel condemns Israel's unfaithfulness by comparing it to adultery, meaning that it was a fleshly desire, a lusting after other gods equals to prostitution, which is a metaphor for idolatry. Talking about the unrestrained idea of this fleshly desires, and we even see this in the other writings, is when they came to the prophet Shemuel, saying, Samuel, we want a king like the other nations. So there was an idea as we've got a desire, and we need to fill our desire. And eventually Samuel says, but God says to Shemuel, it's not you who they are rejecting, it's me who are they rejecting. So we see this unrestrained fulfillment of the desires of literally a rejection, a metaphor of idolatry. So we even further see in other writings, the Psalms and Proverbs, which constantly warns against giving into, we say lust, but it is actually giving into a fleshly desires, this unrestrained fleshly desires. And it describes how it leads the soul astray from God's path. So the within the biblical context, it is very clear that the act, what has happened again. What has happened in the story of Pinchas has happened again and again, and even are happening today. And these acts are one and the same thing. One thing leads to another, but the ultimate goal is to break down the spiritual barrier and to release, or I won't say release, but to basically break the bond between an individual and his creator, his covenant relationship with God. So we see that the sin is both physical and spiritual. So the lustful acts are not just acts of immorality, but it's acts of spiritual betrayal, turning the body into a tool for idolatry. And specifically among the young people that think that it's just a case of a period in life, and we've gone through this and we've gone through that. It's just a stage that we've gone through, but the problem is that the acts is not just a bodily act, but it could in many ways be a spiritual betrayal, turning this body into a tool of defilement. So the idolatry often then corrupts through desires, and we see this is relevant today. And this is the whole aim, that idolatry often corrupts the desire to serve God, and that the Baal Peor cult used this fleshly pleasures to ensnare people, showing how desires, when uncontrolled, becomes idolatry. So zeal for God's holiness is necessary, and this is what we learned then from Parashat Pinchas. So that Pinchas' action represent a divine call to protect God's holiness from defilement in both body and in spirit. So why does it matter today? So the story of Pinchas isn't an outdated cautionary tale about sexual sin alone. It's about how desire can blind an individual, causing us to betray the fundamental relationship with God. So lust left unchecked, we would say more than lust, fleshly desires left unchecked, any fleshly desires left unchecked, opens the door to spiritual idolatry in whatever form it takes in our lives, whether actual worship of false gods or modern day idols like money, power, status, self-indulgence, and there are so many forms that it can take within a person's life. So the final take in this whole parasha of Pinchas is that the Pinchas episode should unsettle anyone who thinks that spiritual life and physical behavior are unrelated. And it is a stern warning. Sin in the flesh is never isolated from sin of the spirit. Immorality was not just about breaking rules. It was about breaking a sacred covenant, a sacred relationship, and worshipping other gods through the body. Pinchas' zeal was to defend God's holiness and stop this creeping idolatry that came disguised as this fleshly desires in this form of lust. So his action calls us to confront even our own impulses and whatever forms they might take, honestly, and we have to ask, what foreign gods might I be serving through my unrestrained giving in to my unrestrained desires? And with this, I would want to wish each one of you a Shavua Tov, and may he who makes peace upon us, may he make peace upon us and of all Israel, and we say Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kal Yisrael v'yemru